But this morning we are launching into a new sermon series called You Are What You Worship. You are what you worship. In the early 2000s, there was kind of a trend that began for a healthier movement. People looked around at kind of the state of our food industry and decided this is just not adding up. We're seeing more cases of obesity and diabetes. We're seeing rates of just poor health that seem diet related. And so a movement began in which they desired a more natural, healthy, substantive, and really more tasteful way of dieting. And the phrase that came along with this movement that was revitalized and it spiked in the early 2000s. If you do a Google research, this one phrase spiked in the midst of this movement, and it was, "You are what you eat." You are what you eat. Now, don't worry, we're not here this morning to talk about your diet. That's not what we're here for. Although we had a great lesson on table manners around the Lord's Supper. But the reason why this is relevant is because I think we're seeing a similar kind of trend spiritually. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it seems like the world is waking up to this dissatisfaction, this emptiness, this longing for the transcendent. That the world's offer of these mass-produced things that we think can give us temporary pleasure or can satisfy our desire for meaning or purpose or identity, it's like a diet that just doesn't seem to fill us. And now there's this movement in which people are hungering for something more. And so in a time like this, maybe one of the most important phrases that we could consider is exactly this: you are what you worship. And just like a diet, just like everybody eats, everybody worships. Everybody worships. There is a phrase, two Psalms really, that I think capture this so well. It's Psalm 115 and Psalm 34 when it says that those who look to idols become like them. Before that, the psalmist enumerates how idols, they can't speak, they can't talk, they can't do anything. They're lifeless. They are subhuman. And he says, those who look to idols become like them, but those who look to the Lord are radiant. And this is what the focus will be in the next 4 weeks. We become what we behold. We are transformed by what we treasure. You are what you worship. And for the first lesson in this series, our focus will be this: a world full of idols. That phrase, a world full of idols, comes from the moment in Acts 17 when Paul is there in Athens and he remarks, he looks around, and it seems like Luke was possibly making this observation himself. As they were in this city, perhaps Luke himself observed this troubling look on Paul's face, and it says that in this city of Athens, this great metroplex of intellect and wisdom, he noticed all their idols. And it says in Acts 17 that his spirit was grieved within him to see that it was a city full of idols. And the same is true today. The same is true today. We might, in a similar way like Athens, be this metroplex of intellect and wisdom. We're more connected than we ever have been. We have gone through the scientific revolution, and we seem to be this enlightened, superior species to all history past. And yet we still live in a world full of idols. Listen to how one postmodern novelist says it. In 2005, David Foster Wallace, who himself was not a believer, noticed this very trend. And remarking on this very thing, he says, here's something that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And pretty much anything you worship, he says, will eat you alive. And he goes on to enumerate some of these very things. He says, worship money and things. If they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. Worship power and superiority, then you'll always feel weak and afraid, and you'll need ever more power over others to numb yourself to your own fear. Worship intellect, being seen as smart, and you'll always end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. He titled that commencement address, "This is Water." The idea being that this is the water we swim in. A fish doesn't know what water is. He's just immersed in it. And he says in the same way, we are swimming in a world full of idols, full of things that are vying for our attention, vying for the place where we put our worth and meaning and value and significance. Everybody worships. And it doesn't have to be explicitly sinful, much like these things are. Recently, I was talking with someone and they described their experience, their past struggle with this sort of careerism. This idea that I need to climb the ladder of success in the specific career that I'm in. But somewhere along the way, they woke up to that realization, finding themselves exhausted and dissatisfied, and so they kind of pivoted. They changed their life. They realized that this was an idol that was beginning to consume them, and so they shifted from that. But what they noticed in recent days was that someone in their life who went further down that path, who kind of got to the point where he always wanted to arrive, he saw them recently and noticed they're just not like themselves. This person has changed. They're different. And in that moment, it hit him. It's because that person had made careerism their idol. And just like all these things that David Foster Wallace enumerates, these idols take more than they give. And so this is our reality. And if that's the truth, then here's the question that we all need to wrestle with in this very first lesson. What do you worship? What do you worship? To help us answer that, I want to consider what is a familiar story, but perhaps take a slightly different angle. The story of the prodigal son in Luke 15. If you have a Bible, you can turn there to Luke chapter 15, and we'll pick up in verse 11. As we think about this idea, what do you worship? Jesus is gathered in this place, and he speaks addressing this crowd of Pharisees, but among whom are also a diverse group of people. And as the Pharisees grumble about how he eats with tax collectors and sinners, Jesus tells a series of parables about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and finally the lost son. And he says this beginning in verse 11. It says, "There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of wealth that's coming to me.' So he divided his wealth between them." Now, at this point in the parable, it's not completely clear necessarily who the father is, but we know by the end it's abundantly clear that the father represents God. And knowing that helps us understand something very important about the nature of idolatry. At its core, at the very heart of idolatry, is wanting something more than you want the Father. All idolatry, all the worship of these other gods comes down to this one thing. It's wanting God, wanting other things more than you want God. And often, isn't it interesting, we want the Father's things more than we want the Father. And that's what's happening here. To ask for his inheritance is to essentially say, you are as good as dead to me. He wanted the Father's things more than he wanted the Father. Here's how Paul would put it in Romans 1:25. He describes this downward spiral of humanity by saying they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. That is, I think, to say they exchanged the truth about God's goodness and how he was for them and not against them. They exchanged that for this lie that there was something better outside of his kingdom. And it says they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. This is fundamentally what idolatry is about, wanting something more than we want the Father. And notice how this unfolds. It says, not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, and he took a journey into a far country. When I was in about first grade, I decided that I was going to run away from home. I can't remember exactly what happened or what rubbed me the wrong way, but I remember packing up my Lion King suitcase that was no bigger than the width of this podium, and I'm shoving in there toy guns. I think I maybe grabbed like some fruit snacks. I think I threw in a pair of underwear. I was really thinking ahead. And I packed all that up, and I was on my way out the door when my dad got home. And my dad looked at me and he said, son, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm running away from home. And he said, well, all right. It's been a really good 7-8 years. We've really enjoyed getting to know you. You've been pleasant company, but I guess if this is your desire, then... And I remember he opened that door, and at that point I was just kind of frozen right at the entryway, and he literally pushed me out. And I remember the door closing behind me. He remembers the story a little bit differently, but I was out there in the far country of Eileen Street just long enough to know that I was not ready to leave home. But what motivated that? I mean, here I am in first grade. What inspired the idea that I should up and leave home and pack my suitcase and get out of his house? It was that there was some captivating vision, an alternative vision of the life that my parents longed for me. There was a competing kingdom that I thought was better than the kingdom that I was currently in. And here's the point. Idolatry isn't always this conscious act of rebellion. It's the immersive pull of an alternative kingdom, a different story about the good life. Here's how one author puts it in the book, You Are What You Love. He says, we are formed by the cultural practices that are nothing less than secular liturgies. Liturgy being these sort of routines and rhythms and rituals that we just kind of fall into as a part of our everyday life and culture. And he says, within these secular liturgies, they carry a story about human flourishing. Within the newsreel, within the media on your phone, within the conversations and the buzz at work or the news about politics, within the buzz of all of those things is a story about human flourishing that we learn in all these unconscious and subtle ways. And he says they're loaded with a particular vision of the good life, a rival vision of the kingdom. And by our immersion into them, the water we swim in, we're taught what and how to love. This is the way that idolatry works. Very rarely does anyone say, you know what, I want to be consumed by careerism. Or I want to be so obsessed with beauty and attractiveness that I'm just going to sell my soul to this. No one goes about it that way, but it's all these subconscious underneath the surface of things that play and pull on the desires of our heart. And they teach us what and how to love. It's a story that promises more. You can be more successful, more wealthy, more happy, more beautiful, admired, more in control and secure. These are all versions of the far country. And this is what attracts this son. This light, this story that's pulling him away, this alternative vision of the good life. But notice what happens. It says, while he was there in this far country with this competing vision of a good life and this alternative version of the kingdom, it says that he squandered his wealth with reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. You know, idolatry tends to squander the gifts we've been given. Haven't you seen that to be true? Someone is so smart and has such a great brain that they become so confident in their intellect and never develop the work ethic to be successful. Or someone is beautiful, but they become so concerned with their appearance that they end up marrying someone who actually makes them far less radiant. They are someone who is kind, but they become so focused on being helpful that they grow exhausted and bitter and resentful. Or there's a parent who is so diligent about raising their kids that they drive them away through over-attachment and crushing expectations. Idolatry squanders the gifts. And very often, it leaves us feeling like we have spent far more than we ever imagined. And so he comes up with a solution. It says he went out and hired himself to one of the citizens of that country who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. I don't know that Jesus could have possibly come up with any more devastating a story to tell for a Jewish audience than this. Pigs being the symbolic representative of everything that is unclean. And he not only is there among them, he is desiring to be fed by the very same things that feeds their stomachs. And it's this sad and tragic ending of where idolatry tends to lead. And we could discern this picture in really three ways. Looking to idols enslaves us, dehumanizes us, and starves us. Isn't that what happened to this son? He felt liberated when he left the father's house, but now he's become a slave. He's hired himself out for bread. He felt alive. He felt like he had finally come to reach his full potential, but now he's like this animal, completely dehumanized, filling himself with the same food that the pigs eat. And he starves. He wanted to fill his heart's desire, but now he's empty. And this is exactly what idolatry does. We choose what to enthrone, and then the throne controls us. We form our desires, and then those desires form us. They gain a kind of enslaving power over us. And they dehumanize us. They make us a lesser version of ourselves, a less radiant, a less joyful, a less peaceful version of who we are. And ultimately, it leaves us starving and empty and longing for more. Now, we know how this story ends, but I think we need to pause in this moment for a particular reason. Because at this point you might be saying, well, I get the point, I get the idea, I see how this tracks with idolatry, I understand how this is this downward spiral, but how does this son really relate to me? What does idolatry look like for me? I've never gone off into this far country. Perhaps I've never felt like I've squandered everything with reckless living, and so where do I find myself in this story? And that's a great question. It's a question that I think Jesus answers. Picking up in verse 25, the younger son, it says, he comes to his senses, he wakes up, he comes to himself, and he goes to his father's house. His father runs and embraces him and kisses him and welcomes him with open arms. And he throws this celebration. He gives him a robe and a ring and new sandals. He kills the fattened calf, and he says to all the village, rejoice and celebrate, for this son of mine was lost and now he's been found. But then in verse 25 it says, now his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And so he turned to one of the servants and he asked about this. He said, what's going on? What's all this commotion? And the servant said, well, your younger brother has returned. And your father has killed the fattened calf. And there's this celebration going on. And then it says, but he was angry. And he refused to go in. He was angry and he refused to go in. And so the father, it says, came out to him. And he says to the father, look, these many years I have served you, and I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And you could feel the anger and the frustration and the bitterness in this moment. It's as if all of these years of resentment that had built up now pours out right in front of his father. And the father says, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But it was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now has been found. And the parable ends with this looming question: will this older brother enter the feast? And what I want us to notice is that while he never left the Father's house, he was still living in a world full of idols. First of all, notice that even though he didn't ask for the inheritance, he wants something more than the Father. Namely, this approval and honor and recognition. And even though he never went into the far country, he too is captivated by this rival vision of the good life. One where he is honored and revered and esteemed for all his good works. And even though the Father has given him everything, this son has squandered it with ingratitude. And isn't it interesting that he calls himself a slave? All these years I've slaved away for you. And the truth is that the master that he was enslaved to was this approval, this honor, this recognition. And just like the younger son was, he too is dehumanized. He's unable to feel compassion and joy, which would be the most natural human response when a brother would return. But instead of acting with the most natural human response of compassion and joy, in which the Father himself says, it's fitting, it's natural, it's the most human expression to celebrate that your brother has returned. Instead, this idol has dehumanized him to where he can't even feel the joy that should come to him. And now he too is quite literally starving outside the feast, starving for this approval and honor he feels he never received. And so we come back around to this question: what do you worship? What do you worship? My assumption this morning is that if you're here, you worship God. And I am not in any way questioning that. I heard the songs of praise. We all bowed our heads together. The assumption is absolutely that you worship God, and yet we still live in a world full of idols. And maybe what we need is to look beneath the surface, to do what David Foster Wallace did and examine the water that we're swimming in. And so this morning, maybe you feel enslaved in some sense, like your emotions or desires are currently out of control, and it's as if there is some power outside of yourself. Or maybe over the past year, you felt like you've become this less radiant, less peaceful, less joyful, less loving version of yourself. Or maybe you felt starved and empty and dissatisfied with life, dissatisfied even in the Father's house. And you're longing for more. If that's the case in any way, then look beneath the surface, because it's very likely that there's some idol, there is some animating force beneath that. Because we live in a world full of idols. And the truth is that those who look to idols become like them, but those who look to the Lord are radiant. You become what you worship. And so this morning I want to close with a story that may help us pinpoint our idols. Next week we'll look at how those who behold the Lord become radiant, but I want to end with this story that is from a man named Tim Keller. And he was a preacher in New York for a number of years. He passed away just a year or two ago. But he shared this story about a young woman who grew up as this just beautiful child. She was adored and doted on. I mean, she was just the affection of everybody in the room. And she grew into this very attractive and beautiful young woman. And for a while, that was great. A lot went her way, as that tends to go. But over time, she began to idolize the attention and the praise and the admiration that she received from other people. So much so that it led her into a string of terrible relationships that alienated her from her family and left her feeling like this dim, broken, and empty version of herself. Until one day she came to her senses. She came to her senses and she finally sought help from a therapist. And what happened there, she said, was so interesting. The therapist said, it sounds like you really have a grasp on what's going on here. You've really looked beneath the surface. You realize that what's going on is you have been chasing after the admiration and affection from these men, believing that that's what is going to give you value and meaning and satisfaction. And so that's great, you've identified this, and so now what you need to do is you need to find, maybe instead of finding this in men. Maybe a career. Maybe you need to find some way to excel in a hobby or some art. Surround yourself with a group of supportive friends. And she realized none of those things are bad, but in that moment, it was as if the light bulb went off. That all of those things were just ways of transferring her need for admiration to things that were never going to satisfy. That these recommendations, as good as they may be to some extent, it was just a transferring of her loyalty, of her love, of her wants, her desires into something else that she would think would somehow bring the admiration she longed for. And what she realized in essence was that she needed the Father's house. His loving arms, His robe of affection, His ring of approval, His feast to taste and see that the Lord is good. His delight over her, making her come alive and become her true self, reflecting His glorious image. She needed the Father's house. It's very likely that this morning there's someone who feels a similar need. That perhaps you, as you've desired to worship and serve the Lord, you've also found yourself swimming in this world full of idols. And that there are things that have captured your desires, your wants, your wishes. And as you have formed those desires have begun to form you. And you feel the effects. Maybe you feel enslaved. You feel like you're becoming this lesser version of yourself. You're feeling empty. And if that's the case, then remember how the story of that first son ends. Not sitting there in the distant country, but with this realization that he needed the Father's house. And if you desire that this morning, then look to the Lord and become radiant. We offer that right now as together we stand and as we sing.